It is May 1816. In Europe, the world turns its gaze toward two extraordinary writers whose visions of horror and imagination still resonate today. Mary Shelley of England and Bram Stoker of Ireland. Each transformed shadows into stories, blending fear, loss, and imagination to create legends that outlived their own age, giving birth to monsters that still haunt the human mind across centuries. Let us begin with the first, Mary Shelley of England. Mary Shelley was born on the 30th of August in the year 1797 in London, England. What kind of woman emerges from a childhood steeped in philosophy and sorrow? How did the daughter of two of England's most radical thinkers become the voice behind one of the world's most haunting tales? Was her brilliance inherited or born from loss, love, and isolation? Mary Shelley entered the world already bound to tragedy. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, a bold advocate for women's rights, died just 11 days after giving birth to her. Her father, William Godwin, was a revolutionary philosopher who tried to raise Mary in the spirit of reason and independence. Yet even as he guided her mind, he struggled to support the family and remarried a woman who would never win Mary's affection. In this environment of books, lectures, and bitter tension, young Mary was shaped. Her father's home became a gathering place for intellectuals and radicals, where she overheard the ideas that would later animate her fiction. And while other girls learned manners and stitching, Mary wandered through graveyards, reading her mother's writings and imagining what it meant to live and die with purpose. Mary Shelley's world was no ordinary home. Instead of fairy tales and nursery rhymes, her childhood was filled with philosophy, politics, and poetry. Her father, William Godwin, believed that children should grow into thinkers, independent, honest, and free. So he opened his library to Mary and introduced her to poets like Samuel Taylor Coleridge and revolutionaries like Aaron Burr. These were the guests at their dinner table, and these ideas became the roots of her imagination. Although Mary received only brief formal schooling, she had a governess, a daily tutor, and free reign over her father's extensive collection of books. She was drawn to stories of ancient Rome and Greece, and she read the fiery works of her mother, who had died before Mary could ever know her. But through her mother's writings, especially a vindication of the rights of woman, Mary found a guide and a ghost, an absent parent who still shaped her every thought. In 1712, when Mary was just 15, her father described her as bold, curious, and unstoppable in her pursuit of knowledge. That same year, she was sent to live in Scotland with the Baxter family, an experience that offered her peace, open skies, and time to dream. There, in the quiet hills near Dundee, Mary began writing. She would later say that beneath those bleak, windswept mountains, her true imagination was born. This blend of loss, literature, and radical upbringing would prepare her not only to write, but to challenge the very society she lived in and leave behind a legend. When Mary returned from Scotland in the spring of 1814, she was 16 years old, bright, spirited, and brimming with ideas. That was when she met Percy Bysshe Shelley, a passionate poet and admirer of her father's political writings. Percy was already married, but his heart was restless, and his beliefs were radical. He rejected convention, challenged religion, and believed in the power of love above all else. For Mary, he was not just a suitor, he was the embodiment of everything her parents had once believed in. They met often at her mother's grave in the churchyard of St. Pancras. There, surrounded by stone and silence, their love took root. On the 26th of June in 1814, Mary confessed her feelings. What followed was no ordinary courtship, it was a rebellion. Her father disapproved fiercely. Shelley was married, broke, and unreliable, but Mary, caught between duty and desire, chose her own path. By the end of July, Mary and Percy had eloped, fleeing to France with her stepsister Claire Claremont. Their journey through war-torn Europe was chaotic and romantic, filled with poverty, adventure, and shared dreams. Mary was already pregnant by the time they returned to England. The scandal tore her family apart. Her father refused to see her. Society turned its back. But despite the pain, Mary stood by Percy. Their love was intense, difficult, and unconventional, but it also pushed Mary deeper into the world of poetry, politics, and imagination. She was no longer just the daughter of radicals. She was becoming one herself. In late July of 1814, Mary Godwin, Percy Shelley, and Claire Claremont slipped away from England, crossing the English Channel to begin what Mary later described as an incarnate romance. Their goal was freedom from rules, debts, and judgment, but what awaited them was both adventure and hardship. France was still recovering from years of war, and their journey through its towns and villages showed Mary the true cost of revolution and suffering. With little money, they traveled by mule, foot, and carriage, pushing forward through rain, mud, and strange towns. Mary and Percy filled their journals with observations, poetry, and dreams, even as they grew hungrier and more exhausted. At Lucerne, their funds finally ran out. They turned back, floating down the Rhine and eventually returning to England in September, but nothing was the same at home. Mary was pregnant, ill, and nearly penniless. Her father refused to take her back. She and Percy moved from place to place, struggling to stay ahead of creditors. They lived simply but surrounded themselves with books, letters, and ideas. Friends came and went, including the writer Thomas Love Peacock and Shelley's college companion Thomas Hogg. Mary, heartbroken and hopeful, clung to Percy and the ideals they both cherished, but reality was harsh. In February of 1815, she gave birth to a premature daughter who lived only a few days. The loss devastated her. Even so, these early years of exile shaped her spirit. Mary was learning to survive, not just as a writer or a lover, but as a woman determined to find her voice in a world that refused to welcome her. The early months of 1815 brought Mary Shelley heartbreak. Her first child, a baby girl born prematurely, died after just a few days. Mary, still a teenager, sank into grief and guilt. She wrote haunting letters, filled with sorrow, imagining her baby returning to her in dreams. This tragedy marked the beginning of many losses that would define Mary's young adulthood. Even as she mourned, Mary's life was marked by instability. Percy Shelley's finances were a constant source of stress. He often fled their lodgings to avoid creditors, leaving Mary and Claire to manage on their own. The young couple moved frequently, chasing temporary refuge from their troubles. Despite the chaos, their bond remained intense, equal parts love and philosophy. But new hope emerged with the birth of their second child in January 1816, a boy they named William after her father. The small family moved to a cottage at Bishopsgate, near Windsor Great Park. It was a peaceful place, and for a time life felt gentler. Percy wrote his poem Alastor, and Mary found space to heal and write, though her journal from this period has been lost. Still, all was not calm beneath the surface. The past lingered, Percy's debts, his flirtations, and the judgment of society. Mary found herself isolated from her family and misunderstood by the world around her. Yet amid the loss and uncertainty, her imagination stirred. She had seen death up close. Now she would begin to ask the question that would one day change literature forever. What if life could be brought back from the dead? In May of 1816, Mary, Percy, their baby son William, and Claire Claremont traveled to Switzerland. Their destination was Lake Geneva, where Claire hoped to reconnect with Lord Byron, now a literary sensation and father of her unborn child. Byron had rented the grand Villa Diodati, and Percy secured a nearby house for their group. What followed would become one of the most legendary summers in literary history. The weather that year was strange. The skies were dark, the air cold and wet, the result of a volcanic eruption across the globe that cast a shadow over Europe. Mary later described it as a wet, ungenial summer. Trapped indoors by the constant rain, the group passed the time with long conversations, lakeside walks, and readings of eerie German ghost stories. One night, Lord Byron proposed a challenge. Each of them would write a ghost story. Mary, the youngest in the group at just 18, felt immense pressure. Each morning they asked, "Have you thought of a story?" And each morning she replied, "Not yet." Days passed, and still she had nothing. Then one sleepless night, everything changed. Mary experienced what she called a waking dream. In her mind's eye, she saw a pale student kneeling beside a lifeless body, watching as it twitched into motion. It was terrifying and thrilling, and it was entirely hers. That moment would give birth to Frankenstein, a novel that would bridge the worlds of horror, science, and philosophy. In that stormy Swiss summer, Mary Shelley stepped from shadow into legacy, her voice clear, her vision unforgettable. Mary Shelley began writing Frankenstein in the months following her waking dream beside Lake Geneva. At first, she imagined it only as a short tale, but Percy encouraged her to develop it into a full-length novel. By early 1817, she had completed a draft. She was just 19 years old. The story, now famous, told of Victor Frankenstein, a young scientist who creates life from dead matter only to be haunted by his creation. It was bold, eerie, and deeply emotional. It questioned the limits of science, the danger of unchecked ambition, and the loneliness of the outsider. Mary had taken the grief, love, and loss of her own life and reshaped it into something timeless. In January of 1818, Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, was published anonymously. Readers were fascinated, but many assumed Percy Shelley was the author since he had written the preface, and his name appeared on the dedication. Mary did not mind. Her goal had never been fame, it was to tell the truth she felt inside. Over time, critics and scholars began to recognize the depth of Mary's creation. Frankenstein's monster became a cultural icon, a misunderstood being trapped between life and death. And Mary, though still just a young woman, had carved out a place in literary history. She had written not just a ghost story, but a mirror to the modern world, a story born of sorrow and imagination, asking one haunting question: what happens when man tries to play God? Frankenstein was her answer, and the world would never be the same. In the autumn of 1816, Mary and Percy Shelley returned to England. Though she now bore the title Mrs. Shelley, Mary faced a storm of grief and public scandal. Within months, tragedy struck twice. Her half-sister Fanny Imlay was found dead from an overdose in a Bristol inn. Soon after, Percy's estranged wife Harriet drowned herself in the Serpentine Lake in London. Both deaths were hushed up, but they weighed heavily on Mary's conscience. In an effort to secure custody of his children, Percy married Mary on the 30th of December in 1816. Her father, William Godwin, attended the ceremony, finally bridging the painful rift between them. But the couple's troubles were far from over. Percy's legal battle ended in failure, and his children were placed with a clergyman's family. Mary, now pregnant again, moved with Percy and Claire to a new home in Marlow. There, in a cold, damp house beside the Thames, she gave birth to her third child, Clara. The family worked tirelessly on their writing, surrounded by friends like Leigh Hunt, while Mary edited their travel journals into the book history of a 6-week tour. But peace remained elusive. Percy was often away in London to escape creditors, and Mary was left to manage their fragile world alone. In early 1817, she completed the final draft of Frankenstein, ready for publication. The book, like her life, was born of pain and perseverance. Despite success, Mary Shelley was still surrounded by loss. Even her victories came wrapped in sorrow, a pattern that would follow her for years to come. In March of 1818, Mary and Percy Shelley left England behind, seeking health, peace, and freedom in Italy. Alongside Claire Clairmont and her child Allegra, they traveled across the sun-drenched landscapes of Venice, Naples, Rome, and Florence. For a brief time, it felt like a new beginning, filled with art, poetry, and escape from English judgment. But Italy was not the paradise they had imagined. Soon after arriving, Mary suffered a crushing blow. Her infant daughter Clara died in Venice. Less than a year later, her beloved son William died of malaria in Rome. The grief was almost unbearable. Mary withdrew into herself, distant from Percy and devastated by the loss of 2 more children. Yet even in mourning, Mary kept writing. In Italy, she completed her novella Matilda and began work on the historical novel Valperga. These works revealed a deeper side of her, full of emotional depth, loss, and feminist insight. Meanwhile, Percy found inspiration in the ruins of the past, composing some of his most famous poetry. Despite their shared love for ideas and freedom, the couple faced strain. Percy became infatuated with other women, and Mary, though hurt, tried to remain loyal. She formed close friendships of her own, clinging to intellectual companionship as a source of strength. The Italian years were a mix of beauty and sorrow. Mary called Italy a country which memory painted as paradise, even as it took so much from her. She was no longer the girl who had run off to France. In Italy, Mary Shelley became both a grieving mother and a mature, determined author, scarred but unbroken. By the summer of 1822, the Shelleys had settled in a small coastal home near the Bay of Lerici. Though Mary was once again pregnant, the mood was uneasy. The house was cramped, the weather stifling, and Percy spent more time with their friend Jane Williams than with Mary. Claire Clairmont lived nearby, and their circle of poets and radicals continued to dream of new books and bold ideas. But beneath the creativity, there was growing restlessness. Percy and his friend Edward Williams had acquired a new sailing boat, their favorite escape from the pressures of life on land. Mary, feeling fragile and isolated, miscarried in June and nearly died. Percy's quick thinking, plunging her into a bath of ice, saved her life. Still, Mary remained weak, and their relationship was strained. On the 8th of July in 1822, Percy set off by sea with Edward Williams and their young boat boy, Charles Vivian, heading north to Livorno. They never returned. A sudden storm caught their boat on the open water. For 10 long days, Mary hoped for word, until 3 bodies washed ashore near Viareggio. The body of Percy Shelley was barely recognizable. His friends, including Lord Byron and Edward Trelawney, cremated him on the beach. Mary, just 24, was left widowed and broken. The death of Percy marked the end of Mary's youth. In a single moment, she lost her husband, her closest intellectual companion, and the life they had imagined together. But though Percy's body was gone, Mary would carry his legacy and her own story forward into the years ahead. After Percy Shelley's tragic death, Mary Shelley faced the world alone. She was just 24, a grieving widow with 1 surviving child and no stable income. For a year, she remained in Genoa with Leigh Hunt and his family, helping transcribe poetry and trying to gather herself. She resolved to live, not for fame or romance, but for her son, Percy Florence, and for her pen. Returning to England in July of 1823, Mary found little comfort. Her father-in-law, Sir Timothy Shelley, refused to meet her, though he offered a small allowance for Percy Florence's care, under strict conditions. Mary accepted, but her independence came at a price. Any mention of Percy's life in public risked the end of their financial support. Still, Mary persevered. She focused on editing Percy's poems, preserving his legacy while carefully avoiding controversy. But writing was also her own salvation. In the years that followed, she published several novels, including Valperga, The Last Man, Lodora, and Faulkner. Each one reflected her inner world, loss, resilience, and a deep questioning of society's rules. Mary also raised her son with fierce devotion, overseeing his education and keeping him close. Though they had little, they lived simply, surrounded by books and ideals. Her small social circle included old friends like Leigh Hunt and new admirers like the American writer Washington Irving. These years were not easy, but they were marked by growth. Mary Shelley proved that she could survive, not just as a widow of a famous poet, but as a writer, a thinker, and a mother with a voice entirely her own. In the decades after Percy Shelley's death, Mary Shelley built a quiet but powerful career. She wrote not only novels, but travel books, biographies, and short stories, all while raising her son and managing the constant tension with her in-laws. Though she lived modestly, her mind remained restless and deeply engaged with the world around her. Mary never abandoned the radical ideas she had inherited from her parents. She believed in equality, social reform, and the power of education. Through her novels, she explored themes that few women dared to touch: the failures of patriarchy, the cost of ambition, and the emotional depth of women's lives. In Lodora and Faulkner, she examined the struggles of mothers and daughters, using fiction to question the rigid roles society assigned to women. Mary also contributed biographies of famous authors to Dionysius Lardner's Cabinet Cyclopedia, showcasing her deep respect for literary history. She wrote under pressure, often to support herself and her aging father. Yet she never compromised her ideals. When a publisher asked to cut the radical sections from Percy's Queen Mab, Mary stood firm, even convincing friends to help her preserve it. Her politics were not just words on paper. She helped women in need, secured false passports to protect a friend's relationship, and offered money to those shunned by society. She lived by her convictions, quietly, without fanfare, but with remarkable consistency. Mary Shelley was more than the author of Frankenstein. She was a political thinker, a defender of women's rights, and a literary force who used her pen not only to tell stories, but to change them. Mary Shelley's life was shaped by powerful ideas: freedom, reason, and the fight for equality. Though she lived in a society that often silenced women, Mary used her writing to challenge those limits. She followed in her mother's footsteps, weaving feminist themes into her novels long before such ideas were widely accepted. In The Last Man, Valperga, and Lodora, Mary centered her stories on women's experiences, emotions, and resilience. She questioned the value of power and conquest, showing instead how compassion and cooperation, often led by women, could reshape society. These weren't just characters on a page. They reflected Mary's own strength and the beliefs passed down from Mary Wollstonecraft. At home, her life revolved around her only surviving child, Percy Florence. She guided his education, nurtured his talents, and stayed close through every stage of his life. When he married in 1848, Mary welcomed his wife, Jane, and lived with them at the Shelley family estate and in Chester Square, London. For the first time, she experienced financial stability and warmth in her home. But her role as a mother didn't quiet her voice. Mary continued to publish, support struggling women, and defend her late husband's legacy. She refused to let his radical ideas be erased and ensured that her own were not forgotten. Though often overlooked in her time, Mary Shelley was a pioneer. She redefined what it meant to be a writer, a widow, and a woman in a world that offered few freedoms. Her stories lived beyond her, inspiring generations to come, not only through terror and tragedy, but through courage and truth. As Mary Shelley entered her final years, the shadows of illness and memory began to gather. From the late 1830s onward, she suffered from recurring headaches, paralysis in her arms, and periods of extreme fatigue. Despite these setbacks, she continued to write and revise her husband's poetry, determined to protect both his reputation and her own place in literary history. She also guarded her privacy. Though she remained close to her son and daughter-in-law, Mary became more cautious with friends. She turned down romantic proposals, including one from the American actor John Howard Payne, saying she could never marry again unless it was to someone as extraordinary as Percy. Though still charming and respected, she lived with a quiet sense of loss and distance from the world she had once moved through so boldly. Even in illness, Mary was alert to danger. In the 1840s, she was targeted by several blackmailers, including a man posing as Lord Byron's illegitimate son. Each time, she handled the threats with dignity and courage, protecting her family and reputation. Mary's contributions to literature were beginning to be recognized, but slowly. Her most famous work, Frankenstein, had already inspired stage plays and adaptations, yet critics still often linked its power to Percy's influence. Still, she pressed on publishing travel books, contributing to literary journals, and preserving her voice. As the world around her changed, Mary remained committed to writing with purpose. She had lived through revolutions, heartbreaks, and storms, and in her final years, she stood not only as Percy's widow, but as a writer in her own right, ready to be remembered. On the first day of February in the year 1851, Mary Shelley passed away at the age of 53. Her final years had been marked by declining health, and her physician believed a brain tumor was the cause of her lingering pain and eventual death. She died peacefully at her home in Chester Square, London, surrounded by her son Percy Florence and his wife Jane, the two people who had remained closest to her heart. Though Mary had once asked to be buried beside her parents, Percy and Jane chose instead to lay her to rest at St. Peter's Church in Bournemouth. Later, they exhumed the remains of her parents, Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin, and reburied them beside her, finally uniting a family that had shaped the world through pen and principle. Mary's legacy, however, was just beginning to bloom. Inside her desk, they found locks of her lost children's hair, the shared notebook she had kept with Percy, and a silk-wrapped package containing ashes from his cremation. Evidence of a life lived in deep love, reflection, and remembrance. In the centuries since her death, Mary Shelley has become a symbol of literary courage and visionary storytelling. Her novel Frankenstein is now recognized as one of the first true works of science fiction, blending moral inquiry with human imagination. Scholars continue to explore her writings, her feminism, and her radical politics. Mary Shelley was never merely the wife of a famous poet. She was a pioneer, a survivor, and a writer who transformed grief into greatness. Her life taught the world that even in the darkest times, creativity and conscience could still shine. Let us now turn to another remarkable figure of royal descent. Abraham Bram Stoker of Ireland was born on the 8th of November in the year 1847 in Clontarf, a coastal suburb of Dublin, Ireland. What hidden dreams stirred inside a bedridden boy surrounded by tales of folklore and firelight? How did a child once too weak to walk grow into the mind that birthed one of literature's greatest monsters? And what haunted truths did he draw from his own past as he shaped the legend of Dracula? Bram Stoker's early life began in near silence and shadow. As the third of 7 children, he was born into a middle-class Protestant family during a time when Ireland was still reeling from famine and political unrest. His father, Abraham Stoker Sr., worked as a civil servant in Dublin Castle, a respected but rigid man known for his discipline and duty. His mother, Charlotte Mathilda Blake Thornley, came from a distinguished family and carried with her a rich trove of Irish folklore and dark stories, many drawn from her memories of the Great Cholera epidemic. From birth until about the age of 7, Bram suffered from a mysterious illness that left him unable to walk. While doctors offered little hope, it was his mother who kept his imagination alive, filling long hours with myths, family history, and chilling tales from Irish tradition. Her stories were often grim, filled with plagues, ghosts, and survival, the very elements that would one day pulse through his fiction. In that fragile, dream-soaked childhood, Bram Stoker first glimpsed the thin veil between the living and the dead, a veil he would one day tear wide open. Bram Stoker's early childhood was marked by physical weakness and long confinement. For nearly 7 years, he was too ill to walk, spending much of his time in bed while the world moved on outside his window. Yet in that stillness, something extraordinary took root, a mind alive with stories, dreams, and questions. His mother, Charlotte, became his constant companion and first teacher. A woman of sharp intellect and vivid memory, she recounted stories of the cholera epidemic that had ravaged Ireland when she was young. She spoke of mass graves, cursed towns, and people buried alive in terror and haste. These weren't fairy tales, they were grim, real, and soaked in fear. To young Bram, they were unforgettable. During this time, he also became a silent observer of family life. He listened carefully, imagined deeply, and wrote down early fragments of thought. His room was both a prison and a sanctuary, where fear and fantasy blended into a private world. Even without formal schooling in those early years, Bram taught himself to read by candlelight and copied passages from books for comfort and practice. By the time he finally recovered and began walking again, he had already formed a worldview that was anything but ordinary. He had faced helplessness, heard whispers of death, and survived long hours of solitude. But rather than fading into the background, Bram emerged from his bed stronger, not just in body, but in mind. His imagination, once his only companion, would become the very thing that carried him into the heart of London's literary world, and far beyond. In 1864, at the age of 17, Bram Stoker entered Trinity College in Dublin, one of the most prestigious universities in Ireland. It was a remarkable transformation for someone who had spent much of his childhood bedridden. Now full of health and curiosity, Bram embraced student life with a quiet intensity that would define his years there. He studied mathematics and science, but his true passions lay beyond the classroom. He joined the University Philosophical Society, where debates sparked his love for public speaking and logical thinking. He also became a member of the College Historical Society, sharpening his rhetorical skills while immersing himself in history, politics, and performance. In these halls, he learned how to command a room, a skill that would later shape both his career and his characters. Despite his quiet nature, Bram was admired for his diligence and thoughtful manner. He graduated with honors in 1870, having already begun to write articles and reviews for local publications. But what set him apart wasn't just his academic record. It was his ability to combine intellectual rigor with a flair for the dramatic. During these years, he also explored the theater, attending plays that stirred something deep within him. The power of a story told in darkness, with actors moving through light and shadow, would leave a lasting impression. At Trinity, Bram Stoker moved from silent child to young thinker. He wasn't yet the author of Dracula, but the foundations were being laid in thought, voice, and ambition. A life once shaped by silence was now being built on sound and story. After graduating from Trinity College in 1870, Bram Stoker faced a crossroads. While he longed to write and explore creative work, he also needed a stable income. Like many young men of his background, he entered the civil service. He took a position at Dublin Castle as a clerk in the Petty Sessions Legal Department, a job that was routine, precise, and far from thrilling. Yet even in this quiet role, Bram found ways to channel his passions. He began writing reviews for the Dublin Evening Mail, often covering the theatre scene. These weren't just polite summaries. Bram wrote with depth, understanding the soul of the performance. His reviews stood out, catching the attention of Dublin's cultural circles and introducing him to a broader network of actors, writers, and producers. It was during this time that he also began writing fiction. His first published story, The Crystal Cup, appeared in 1872. He also wrote essays and short pieces on topics ranging from art to law. Though his government job paid the bills, his heart was increasingly drawn to the stage and the page. He soon became an unpaid drama critic, which brought him into regular contact with Dublin's theatre world, a place filled with energy, ambition, and spectacle. And it was through this world that Bram would encounter the most important figure of his early career, Henry Irving. Though still unknown outside of Ireland, Bram was already carving a dual path, one grounded in public duty, the other in imagination. The life of a clerk gave him order. The theatre gave him life. In December of 1876, everything changed for Bram Stoker. That winter, the famed English actor Henry Irving came to Dublin to perform at the Theatre Royal. Bram, still working as a civil servant and writing theatre reviews in his spare time, attended one of the performances and was captivated by Irving's stage presence. The power, depth, and shadow Irving brought to the role of Hamlet left an indelible impression. Bram reviewed the performance with extraordinary praise. To his surprise, Irving invited him to dinner as thanks. Their meeting would spark a connection that would shape the rest of Bram's life. The two men were opposites in many ways. Irving was fiery, eccentric, and ambitious. Bram was thoughtful, steady, and fiercely loyal. Yet their bond grew quickly, built on mutual respect and a shared love for the dramatic arts. Irving saw in Bram a man he could trust, not just as a critic, but as an organizer, writer, and friend. In return, Bram admired Irving's talent and confidence, even as he glimpsed the darker sides of his personality. Their friendship would become both a partnership and a devotion, lasting decades and defining Bram's professional path. Soon after, Irving offered Bram a position as business manager of the Lyceum Theatre in London. It was a bold leap, leaving civil service behind to work full-time in the world of performance. But Bram accepted. That moment marked a turning point. No longer a part-time writer or reviewer, Bram Stoker was now stepping onto the grand stage of London, not as an actor, but as the quiet force behind one of England's greatest performers. In 1878, Bram Stoker moved to London to begin his new life as business manager of the Lyceum Theatre, one of the city's most prestigious and storied performance venues. At its heart was Henry Irving, now a rising star and the first actor to be knighted by the British Crown. Bram's role was far more than administrative. He became Irving's right hand, organizing tours, managing finances, handling publicity, and keeping the daily operations running smoothly. The Lyceum was a place of magic and exhaustion. The pace was relentless. Irving's productions were elaborate, his ambitions endless. Bram worked behind the scenes with tireless energy, often from morning until late into the night. He earned respect for his loyalty and his quiet efficiency. Though not a performer himself, Bram was central to the theatre's success. This new chapter also brought him into London's elite social circles. He met authors, artists, politicians, and royalty, rubbing shoulders with the likes of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Alfred Lord Tennyson, and Oscar Wilde. Despite these glamorous surroundings, Bram remained humble and hardworking, always in the background, supporting Irving's brilliance while keeping the theater alive. At the same time, Bram continued to write. He published short stories, essays, and began drafting early ideas that would one day evolve into his most famous novel. But for now, the Lyceum was his world. In London, Bram Stoker became more than just an Irish critic. He became a trusted figure in the beating heart of English theatre, living in the shadows of footlights and fame, yet preparing, slowly and quietly, to leave a mark far deeper than any actor's applause. While Bram Stoker's professional life flourished in the theatre, his personal life also took a significant turn. In the summer of 1878, shortly before relocating to London, he married Florence Balcombe, a celebrated beauty from Dublin's social circles. Notably, Florence had once been courted by Oscar Wilde, a fellow Irishman and literary giant in the making. Her decision to marry Bram instead of Oscar surprised some, but Bram offered a steady, devoted presence. The couple moved into a modest home in Chelsea, London, close to the Lyceum Theatre. 2 years later, in December of 1880, they welcomed their only child, a son named Irving Noel Thornley Stoker, honoring Bram's deep admiration for Henry Irving. Life in London's artistic world brought new experiences. The Stokers entertained regularly, with Florence managing the household and social engagements while Bram balanced his theatre duties and writing projects. Though not wealthy, they moved within high society, attending dinners, lectures, and literary salons. Bram gained a reputation as a thoughtful, reliable figure with a quiet but formidable intellect. Yet beneath the surface, there were tensions. Bram's devotion to Irving consumed much of his time, and his long working hours often kept him away from home. Some biographers have speculated about emotional distance between Bram and Florence, though little was openly discussed during their lifetime. Still, these years marked a period of outward stability. Bram had a family, a respected position, and growing connections in the literary world. But while society saw him as a polished gentleman and theatre man, few realized he was already nurturing darker visions, stories shaped not by fame, but by fear, solitude, and imagination. Amid the glitter of theatre life and London society, Bram Stoker's true creative work often happened in the margins, late at night, long after the Lyceum's curtains had closed and its crowds had gone. By day, he was the efficient theatre manager, always present and composed. But by night, he transformed into something else, a solitary writer chasing shadows across the page. In the quiet of his study, Bram penned tales of mystery, fear, and the unknown. His early stories blended folklore with moral questions, often featuring supernatural beings, grim consequences, and haunted landscapes. These writings were far from the glamour of the stage. They came from a place of inner tension, reflection, and unspoken dread. Bram's notebooks from these years reveal a man drawn to themes of duality, light versus darkness, order versus chaos, the rational mind grappling with something ancient and wild. He took inspiration from Celtic myths, Christian theology, Eastern European legends, and the Gothic tales of earlier writers like Edgar Allan Poe and Sheridan Le Fanu. Yet his writing remained private, tucked between theatre commitments and family duties. Few in his social circle knew how deeply he was drawn to the macabre. His stories, often published quietly in magazines or anthologies, were respected but not celebrated. Still, Bram kept writing not for fame, but because something within him demanded it. As he grew older, the pull of fiction grew stronger, and his imagination reached further into the darkness. A single, terrifying idea had begun to form, one that would eventually take the shape of a name known around the world. But that monster was still sleeping. For now. Throughout the 1880s and early 1890s, Bram Stoker's role as theater manager for Henry Irving took him across Britain and beyond. These travels, though focused on business, became quiet opportunities for research. In hotel rooms, train compartments, and backstage lounges, Bram jotted notes, collected legends, and studied the human condition. Every shadow, every stranger, every old castle became a possible setting for his growing fascination with horror. He devoured books on folklore, mythology, and medicine. He studied European superstitions and vampire lore, from Balkan traditions to Irish tales of the undead. He pored over travelogues and geographic texts, many detailing the far reaches of Transylvania and Eastern Europe. Though Bram never visited the region himself, he read enough to construct a vivid, chilling image of its landscapes and legends. At the British Museum's reading room, he spent long hours buried in ancient texts, studying not only vampire myths, but also disease, decay, and the science of blood. He was fascinated by the blurred lines between fact and fear, how society explained what it could not understand. These years also introduced him to strange characters, hypnotists, spiritualists, and those who believed in the paranormal. Their beliefs and delusions fed his imagination. The idea of a figure who could bend wills, cross boundaries, and feed on the living began to crystallize. By the early 1890s, Bram had filled several notebooks with research. He had a villain, a setting, and a question: what if evil could not be destroyed by reason alone? Out of these shadows, Dracula began to stir, not just a monster, but a myth reborn. By the early 1890s, Bram Stoker had begun the long and careful process of writing the novel that would define his legacy. What started as scattered notes and folklore clippings gradually took form, a dark tale of ancient evil invading the modern world. The story of Dracula was born not in a single flash of inspiration, but through years of quiet labor. Bram approached the novel like a puzzle. He structured it through letters, diaries, newspaper clippings, and telegrams, creating a sense of realism that made the horror feel disturbingly plausible. He didn't simply want to frighten readers, he wanted them to believe that something unspeakable might exist just outside the light. The central character, Count Dracula, was unlike any villain in English literature. He was ancient, cunning, and charismatic, capable of moving through walls, manipulating minds, and transforming his shape. Yet he also carried a tragic aura, hinting at a lost humanity. Bram infused Dracula with both menace and mystery, creating a monster readers could fear and study in equal measure. To build his world, Bram drew from real locations and people. Some believe he based Dracula in part on Vlad the Impaler, a 15th-century ruler of Wallachia known for cruelty. But Bram never confirmed this. His creature was larger than any single legend, a vessel for fear, desire, and the anxiety of a changing age. By 1896, the manuscript was complete. Bram had taken years of pain, research, and imagination and shaped them into a single towering figure, one whose shadow would stretch across centuries. Dracula was ready to be unleashed. In May of 1897, Dracula was published in London by Archibald Constable and Company. The novel appeared quietly at first, no grand publicity campaign, no instant bestseller lists. It was just another Gothic story in a market already crowded with tales of ghosts, ghouls, and graveyards. Yet within weeks, whispers began to spread. Something about this novel was different. Early reviews praised Dracula for its originality and suspense. Critics noted its structure, told through journal entries and letters, gave the story a haunting realism. Some readers were genuinely frightened, while others admired its psychological depth and eerie pacing. Though not a runaway commercial hit, Dracula sold steadily and found an appreciative audience among lovers of dark fiction. The book's themes resonated with the cultural anxieties of the time. In an age of scientific progress and empire, Dracula posed a chilling question. What if the old world with its curses, legends, and monsters had not vanished, but simply hidden in the shadows? The Count's arrival in modern England symbolized more than fear. It was a confrontation between past and present, superstition and science, control and chaos. Bram Stoker's name began to rise in literary circles, but slowly. Unlike some authors whose fame exploded overnight, Bram remained in the background. He continued working at the Lyceum, managing tours and performances, rarely seeking public attention. Yet Dracula had found its way into the bloodstream of English literature. Its bite was quiet but lasting. The world didn't yet know just how deeply it would be marked, or how long it would carry the scar. After Dracula was published, Bram Stoker remained a respected figure in London's literary and theatrical circles, but fame, in the modern sense, eluded him. The novel had received praise, yet it did not immediately transform his life. He continued his exhausting work managing the Lyceum Theatre, supporting Henry Irving's performances while quietly pursuing his own creative projects in the shadows. In the years that followed, Bram published several more novels, including Miss Betty, The Mystery of the Sea, and The Jewel of 7 Stars. While none achieved the impact of Dracula, they revealed his continued fascination with mysticism, ancient curses, and psychological fear. His stories often explored boundaries between the living and the dead, sanity and madness, the known and the hidden. Yet life grew more difficult. By the early 20th century, the Lyceum was in decline. Henry Irving's health was failing and financial troubles loomed. Bram poured himself into his writing, hoping to find both purpose and income through his books. But the market had changed. Readers now wanted different stories, and Bram's brand of slow, atmospheric horror struggled to compete with faster-paced fiction. He also began to feel the physical toll of decades of overwork. His health started to falter, and his ability to promote his work weakened. Still, Bram never stopped writing. It remained his refuge, his way of understanding the world and perhaps himself. Though public recognition faded, Bram Stoker pressed on with quiet determination. He had created a legend but lived without the glory it might have brought. In the long shadow of Dracula, he walked largely unseen, a storyteller waiting for time to catch up. As Bram Stoker moved through the final decade of his life, his inner world became increasingly complex. Raised in a Protestant household but deeply fascinated by folklore and mystery, Bram stood at the crossroads of belief and doubt. The rise of spiritualism in late Victorian England, with its seances, ghost photography, and talk of the afterlife, drew widespread interest. For Bram, these ideas held both allure and danger. He was skeptical of charlatans, but intrigued by the possibility of unseen forces. His writings during this period reflect a deepening exploration of the supernatural, not only as a literary device but as a spiritual question. Could the dead speak? Could evil take form? Was science alone enough to explain all that haunted the human heart? In private, Bram wrestled with fears of failure, obscurity, and physical decline. He worried that his work would be forgotten or misunderstood. Letters from this time reveal moments of discouragement, but also bursts of hope, a belief that stories could still reach people, even if the world seemed indifferent. His fascination with the supernatural also grew darker. In The Lady of the Shroud and The Lair of the White Worm, Bram pushed the limits of Gothic horror, blending religious symbolism, myth, and terror. Critics were divided, some dismissing these works as strange or uneven, but they showed a mind still probing at the edges of reason. This period was one of inner conflict between faith and fear, clarity and confusion. But through it all, Bram Stoker remained committed to his craft. He was not just building monsters. He was asking what it meant to be human in a world filled with shadows. By the early 20th century, Bram Stoker's life had grown quiet, marked by illness, fading recognition, and personal struggle. His health had begun to deteriorate rapidly. Years of overwork at the Lyceum and relentless writing had taken their toll. He suffered strokes, partial paralysis, and problems with vision and memory. Though he kept writing when he could, his strength was no longer the same. Financial hardship added to the strain. With Henry Irving's death in 1905, Bram lost not only a lifelong friend, but also the professional anchor that had supported him for nearly 3 decades. The Lyceum's decline had left him with few resources. His final years were marked by attempts to secure modest earnings through lectures, reprints, and support from literary friends. Public interest in his newer works had waned, and Dracula, though respected, had not yet achieved the legendary status it would one day hold. Bram lived in a modest flat in London, cared for by his wife Florence and supported in part by a civil pension granted in recognition of his service to literature. Despite the challenges, he remained deeply committed to writing. He worked on short stories, revised earlier pieces, and continued to reflect on themes of power, evil, and mortality. His mind still roamed far beyond the limits of his weakened body. Bram Stoker's final years were quiet ones, away from applause and acclaim. But within those silent rooms, he carried the legacy of a man who had given shape to fear and had written not for praise, but because the shadows had never stopped speaking to him. On the 20th of April in the year 1912, Bram Stoker passed away at the age of 64. He died at his home in St. George's Square, London, after years of declining health. The official cause of death was recorded as exhaustion following multiple strokes. Though once central to London's theatre and literary scenes, Bram left the world in relative obscurity, his name remembered by few, his greatest work quietly resting on bookshelves. His wife Florence inherited the task of managing his legacy. She fiercely protected the rights to Dracula, even engaging in legal battles when unauthorized film adaptations began to emerge, most famously the silent German film Nosferatu, released in 1922. Florence won the case, but the film had already cemented the vampire's presence in popular culture. Over time, Dracula refused to fade. It was reprinted, translated, and adapted again and again. The Count became more than a character, he became a myth, reshaped through each generation's fears and fascinations. From stage plays to Hollywood films, from comics to academic studies, Dracula grew larger than Bram himself could have imagined. What critics overlooked during his lifetime, the world came to treasure long after his death. Scholars began to recognize Bram Stoker not only as a Gothic novelist, but as a keen observer of his age, a man who had captured the tensions between modernity and myth, science and superstition, power and desire. Bram Stoker never lived to see the full power of the creature he had unleashed. But in every whisper of a cape, in every flicker of a fang, his story lives on, a shadow cast across time by the pen of a quiet Irishman who gave fear its most unforgettable face. What do you think about Mary Shelley? Was she a visionary author, a woman who gave the world its first true science fiction novel and dared to ask what it means to create life? Or a grieving soul, marked by loss, hardship, and a lifetime spent in the shadow of her husband's fame and her mother's legacy? And what about Bram Stoker? Was he the quiet architect of eternal fear, a brilliant mind who transformed folklore into a timeless symbol of darkness and desire? Or a forgotten figure, worn down by duty, overlooked in life, and only truly celebrated long after his passing? Were these two writers lonely visionaries, connected by the shadows they carried and the questions they dared to ask? Or were they gentle survivors of personal tragedy, using stories to make sense of a world that never quite made room for them? We would love to hear your thoughts. Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales from the past. Stories of courage, choice, and the quiet force behind history. Thank you so much for watching.